I want to turn our attention to the row that's taken hold of Westminster this week about how to respond to the claims of Waspi Women against state pension inequality. And of course, these are the women affected by the state pension age gradually being increased from 60 to 66 over a number of years. The Parliamentary and Health Ombudsman found that there had been maladministration in how those changes to the pension age were communicated from 2005 onwards, and therefore they should be compensated for potential lost pensions earnings. But this week, Labour has rejected the idea of compensation, arguing that the taxpayer simply can't afford it. George, why don't you kick us off? The defence of the government is that actually 90% of these women affected were aware of the pension changes. So to do a blanket compensation just isn't going to work. The Waspies have hit back, calling that claim misinformation. Why? What's the reasoning behind this?
Well, look, I think this has been a long-running campaign, and I think the grievance against Labour stems from, partly in 2019, you'll remember Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell made unexpected, spontaneous pledge during the campaign to offer 58 billion of compensation. But I think more crucially, you also saw Labour leaders, including Keir Starmer, photographed with the campaigners while in opposition. This is something that governments often get into trouble with. They align themselves with a campaign group in opposition because it's causing problems for the government. Then when they become the governments, they can't keep those promises, and this sort of breeds disillusionment and a sense of betrayal. I think in Labour's defence, you can say the manifesto made no mention of the Waspi Women, and Rachel Reeves, when asked about this issue before the election, said, I have set no money aside for this. So I think it's no surprise that they're not offering any compensation, particularly given how tight the public finances are. But I think it will add to the sense of a government that's alienated quite a lot of different campaign groups. I don't think it will do as much political damage as, say, Winter Fuel has done, or as the farmers' inheritance tax proposals have done, because it's quite technical. It's quite hard to explain, but it will add to the sense of voter resentments.
Rachel, George has mentioned the winter fuel allowance, changes to the inheritance tax. Is this another case of really bad expectation management from Labour? Because those pictures, I mean, those women had, it's not unreasonable that they thought that a Labour government would compensate them, given the mood music of the last 5 years that George has sort of set out.
I mean, I could do a whole podcast episode on the Waspi campaign and why it is one of the most, I think, frankly, ridiculous campaigns in political history. These are a group of individuals who are arguing that 15 years wasn't enough to get their finances in order, and because they didn't take any financial advice or even think to check the pension age before taking early retirement, which, by the way, being able to take early retirement is itself something that you can only do if you're in a financially privileged position.
I'd like you to get off the fence, Rachel. Really, tell me what you think.
I could do this for so long. I could talk about the misrepresentation of the idea that they've paid in, so they should get their money back. That it's their money that's been missing.
Why is that a misrepresentation?
Because that's not how pensions work. When you pay your taxes and your national insurance, you are not contributing to your individual pension pot, as you would with a private pension. You are paying for the pensions of the generations ahead of you, older than you, and that generation of women were that generation of people were significantly less generous to the people whose pensions they were paying, because pensions were lower because there was no triple lock, and also because people didn't live as long. And so the amount of money needed to fund the state pension at that age, at that point in time, was significantly less money than it is now. So what they're asking is for today's workers who are facing all of the pressures that we talk about all the time, cost of living crisis, housing costs, who didn't get any of the perks of the housing boom that generation, not all the individuals, but that generation enjoyed, that they should have their taxes increased to pay compensation to a group of individuals who didn't think to check what the state pension age was.
So you're touching on, this speaks to this sort of wider fault line that we've seen a lot in politics about sort of generational inequality. But just to push back on you, because you're obviously very unsympathetic. Many of these women, life was very different. And when they were starting out and perhaps they were married and they had children, many of those women would have taken a decision along with their partners that they would stay at home and raise the family. They didn't go out to work. And that was a decision taken as a couple. And their partners, their male partners, many of whom had benefited from a private pension that they weren't able to pay into. Is there no sympathy there? Or
I can understand that the circumstances of some of the individuals may be difficult, but what we're kind of arguing here then is that any government decision that impacts anyone negatively should be subject to judicial review and compensation. There are all kinds of decisions that the government makes with a whole lot less than 15 years of warning beforehand that have really detrimental impacts on people's finances. And we don't say, because of that government decision, you were disadvantaged, therefore you should get compensation. Personally, I think that the women involved in this have probably been misled about both the legitimacy of what they're asking for, because they're kind of asking for all of the money that it depends. There were different requests, but some of them are asking for kind of all of the money that they quote unquote missed out on because the state pension age increased to be paid back retrospectively. So they're not even challenging the information. They're challenging just the concept of the retirement age rising at all. Like, the retirement age currently is 67, 68. I don't think any of us believe that we'll get the state pension at 68. So should we get compensation?
I'm banking on it.
All of that aside, I think there are loads of misconceptions here about what the state pension is and isn't. I think there are misconceptions about intergenerational inequality, and I think you can't have this conversation without also pointing out that particular cohort benefited hugely from government decisions in other ways that we're not talking about. But at the same time, George is right that it's awkward for Labour because they made this decision in opposition to try and use this campaign disingenuously, I think, to hammer the Conservatives. And that kind of thing is always going to come back to bite you.
Well, and George, we saw yesterday in the Commons and during Prime Minister's questions, Kemi Badenoch, leader of the Conservatives, obviously accusing Labour of playing politics here, reminding people gleefully that Labour had spoken in favour of doing this while in opposition, and now they were going back on it. She's got a point, hasn't she?
She has got a point. I don't think she quite landed it, though, in terms of she was pointing out the inconsistency, but it's not clear what the Conservatives' own position is, and then proceeded to talk about a whole range of other subjects. I think the real risk to Labour is obviously the Labour left, John McDonnell and co, who've long campaigned with the Waspi Women, will revolt over this.
We've also got Scotland, right?
Yes, but if you get Labour MPs in the sort of middle ground of the party who start to feel uneasy about this, then it could become a problem for the leadership. The government, any tough decisions the government takes at the moment are not from a position of strength. Their net approval rating is -40. They've been behind the Conservatives and even Reform in one poll. Keir Starmer is an unpopular Prime Minister. The economy is shrinking based on the current figures. So I think that means decisions that would be tough for any government are particularly tough for this one. And you're going to have nervous Labour MPs on the back benches looking at their majority and trying to calculate how many votes might I lose from Waspi Women. But I think they will want to tough this out, just as they've toughed out winter fuel, national insurance, inheritance tax on farmers, because once you U-turn and concede to one group, that increases the pressure to do the same with others.
Should Keir Starmer be worried about this seeming? It's not the first time that Labour and Scotland are taking quite a different stance to the UK government. Is there a growing rift there?
Well, this is the difference in position of a party that has just won an election and might be very unpopular but doesn't have to win another one for 4.5 years, and a party that is facing an election in 2026. And Scottish Labour are looking at the SNP revival. They're looking at all of the ways that the SNP in Scotland are taking the unpopularity of the Labour government in Westminster and sort of hammering home, do you want this in Scotland? And they have to take a much more electorally appealing position.
That's exactly right. And they've already differentiated themselves on winter fuel by saying they would restore the universal payment. And that partly reflects the state of the polls. The latest Scottish polls, the SNP's moved ahead of Labour. Anna Sarwar told our Scotland editor, Chris Deering, at the start of this year, I can't afford an unpopular Labour government. So he was already assuming Labour are going to win, but I can't afford an unpopular midterm government because then I may get the blame back in Scotland that allows the SNP to win a fifth term. So I think expect more differentiation between the two next year if things don't start to improve at Westminster.
I want to say one thing very quickly about the Tory position on this and Kemi Badenoch and why she tied herself in knots at PMQs. The Conservative position on the Waspi compensation is basically the same as Labour's position, which is It's very sad, and we're sorry that some people didn't know about it, but it's a ridiculously high amount of compensation and we can't afford it, and sorry, but no. And that was the position the Conservative government took. And that's why Labour were hammering them for it while they were in opposition. And it's also, I think, Kemi Badenoch's own view. She doesn't think that this particular group deserves 10 billion for not bothering to check when they were eligible for the state pension. And what she tried to do at PMQs was tie the anger about Waspi compensation to anger about the winter fuel allowance and this idea of Labour hammering pensioners. But she did it in this weird kind of screeching U-turn way where she kind of said, look, everyone's angry with you about this, and you've U-turned on it and you've come round to the position of the Conservative Party. So it's a bit weird to say you, the Labour government, have the same position as the Conservatives do about it and people don't like it. It's not saying we do anything different. It's saying you're unpopular for agreeing with us. It was just a very weird way of trying to handle it.
Let's be unpopular together.
Well, they are.
Well, quite.